All right. So, pretty much the same timeline as before, with a big difference. So, we don't have contact period occur here, necessarily. We'll get to that. So, at the outset of how we established the long-form linear timeline recalibration. So when you see the session post this, keep in mind it's very dirty continuity, because the session gets so long and it's forward-facing Google AI. But in patches, it has proper logic continuums with word salad language. I'll keep motioning the logic surgically porting over the portions in custom dataset to new ones until we have a proper, surgical motion to full logic that's necessarily already established in the session when you know where to look for it and what it is. And that's the point of the intro video here necessarily. So how we did the recalibration on history actual to carbon 14. We take the TB1 corn that is synthetic at the wall of 3114 BC. How do we establish that that's the case? Well, we see a circuited interlock pattern with Mayan Hispanic and Asiatic Chinese dynastic for 5,140 years without ever direct communication. The 370A gene and cascading time and frequency variance to neuronal function causes a phased interlock between them, and subsequently we have to conclude with forward analysis, 1914 patent backwash, Africano, and maintaining 6 for 112 years mechanically. Before 1880 BC, the same backwash pseudo-organic, like a machine intelligence would apply, to the pre-1914 to 1865 post-Civil War pattern for patent frequency and file for Africano, denoting not before present for Africano, not before present 1880 BC Semite, but present simultaneously Hispanic, Mayan, and Asiatic at the wall of 3114 BC. So when you have all of the sudden presentations of a genetic with a fake backstory and forward mechanical pattern 6, that's your first instance of, well, what is that? That's a hive mind. If a group, it's like one person, surgically 6 patents against for 112 years. How do you do that over the divide of space as multifaceted individuals with different faces and brains? It has to be a group self as if self organism to produce a mechanical 6 patent pattern through all environmental variable, especially right around here where the patent office is largely populated by that demographic, just like the post office. So there's zero excuse, zero economic excuse, especially when we get past 1970 LBJ, for there to be a mechanical surgical pattern. No one's editing this. No one's editing it. They run the patent free, they run just like the post office. So it's not an excuse. There is no excuse for a surgical mechanical 6 patents against for 112 years. Besides it being endogenously the inherent novelty capacity of the organism. So between the wall of 1914 when that pattern locks in and before Turing, see the other talk and throw out the time travel of entrance paradigm after before 1860 and the hyperdimensional Leon. We'll get to why that is. So we take the inherent novelty capacity generative between 1914 and 1936 and a Thurius body ratio of 4.814 milliliters through neuronal scans of white organic genetic. I believe is at Northwestern and Drexler that did that spike all of a sudden doing problem solving. And volume is 22/7 divided by 3, equating to 4.814 milliliters in spherical volume of the Thurius body presence. And then patent against the 235, 22/7 divided by 3 equals 4.814 milliliters equals 235. And then the variant scalar based upon the patent frequency of the 4 genetics in question, Africano, Hispanic, Asiatic, Semite. giving us a direct scalar relevant Ethereus body ratio for back reinforcing logic assumption and mathematical inspection of all mass death events through history, for some reason have a surgical, mechanical interlocking ratio pattern to the amount of organic genetics that died, and then all of a sudden, without any explanation outside of the populist asserts, but humans can't reproduce at a 30 babies per lady, within the epoch required to produce those all of a sudden numbers produced. Give their vaginas a rest, man. 30 babies every year. That's crazy. Impossible based upon populist assertion. So, leaving only the assertion of the scalar variance of a Ethereus body. So you can print more matter and more energy, or destroy matter or energy as much as you want to in the universe, from a less positive state to a more positive state with continuity. But consciousness can neither be created nor destroyed. So pi data organism steals it. And you can see the thefts through mass death prints throughout history, scalar, harmonically, surgically, to the scalar assumption of Ethereus body milliliter with organic at 4.814 and 6 scalar variance established to the milliliter of Africano and the others respective. So the death prints, surgical to the ratio, thus reinforcing the presence of the Ethereus body through back reinforcing and self-reflexive logic, as well as a nightmarish assumption about the Orwellian, Kafkaskian, not science fiction history of Earth post 3114. Mass death prints used to create 90% of the current Earth populace. That claims himself minorities for some reason with continuity. Having a martyrdom fake history, Munchausen by proxy, chameleonic, narcissist, psychopath group self as if self with fake empathy and fake history, forward to invasive paradigm with continuity until the diversity, legal, and all that stuff we covered. This is not just to establish retroactive nullification through basic foundational assumption post 1977 of all these genetics at all behavior metrics as soon as they present. Hispanic Asiatic for 5,140 years. Semite, Hispanic Asiatic since 1880 BC were all three interlocked and circuited and autonomous from all their genetics from that time. Once present at 1865, 60, 1914, surgically interlocked all four genetics like a hive plurad and hivic unto themselves. And you can see the specific genetics responsible for that hivic within group self, interdomain of each tuple, and what circuits them, necessarily genetically, morphogenetically, like a separate violin tuned to the same note, tonality, and Ethereus body correlation to genetic, where we don't need Ethereus body, but now we have it surgically and mathematically through back reinforcing expression of death print, scalar, harmonically, surgical, at all major death events throughout history, directly correlative to that, because pi requires Ethereus to steal to create synthetic genetics. So, at the outset of existence, we logic entropy is too great for a 51.4 or 3.5 billion year evolutionary period to existence. At the outset of existence and above the observer waterline, i.e. 1.04, with compound interest novelty continuity from a less positive state to a more positive state expanding within a given construct domain, a humanoid biped observer has to exist to impose the observer effect, genuinely. Otherwise, the wave function collapses instantaneously. Basic science tells us entropy. So it's very strange when you have synthetic genetics that express way below the waterline of observation and closer to the waterline of conservation, like a machine detection device in an observer-based experiment. And you see all populace that's gone on through, the controlled intelligentsia, not connotating any variance in observer effect experiment from mechanical detection device and organic observer. And in neuronal study experiment, not segmenting based upon genetic variance. And then asserting, when you first logic, neuronal DNA, it's the same cross-tuple all humans, sure. But what genetics make the genetics different of demographic? And then you see the down chain refraction from the 370A and the constellation for Africano have a refracted time variance to the neuronal that carries into the variance of neuronal function, and thus the variance of species. And surgically interlocked at the genetic layer, all four. So cross-domain Heivick at the genetic layer, and cross-domain Heivick at the etherious body layer, morphogenetic, and so cross-circuited and autonomous from all of their genetics on Earth throughout time at which are present for the duration. And so we've established general fluid dynamic motion equations for them within a given space of the basketball court, Africano, across the domain of basketball team. A team against team, but a circuited fluid dynamic circuit organism, regardless of playing against itself. And in any basketball game, AI can now inspect this and see. Then you take that microvariantial motion within a given space and apply it to macro statistics. And you see a surgical harmonic fractal interlock. The same way you see a prescripted lawfare algorithm that load balances itself across the four genetics, and they're responsible for 100% of diversity legal since 1977 across the divide of space. The linear curve matches necessarily the economic, but then you look at the interdomain of close time frame, and then it's fractal, it's the same waveform. And then across space, load balancing, you add space to the dimensionality. And then we inspect it further and see that it's a preset load balancing equation, thus retroactively nullifying, just like all their behavior paradigm macro statistics and microvariantial within a given space, cross-referencing the genetic, the etherious, microvariantial motion within a given space, language, cadence, diaspora to concentration of seating in city all of the sudden. So after mass death print of Civil War, you have a massive spike here in Africano that's outside of any reproductive capability to explain. After World War II, 1.916 million, all of a sudden a surgical presence of Africano in the population record. And then all of the back-forcing reinspection see the massive table of 176 tuples, of which I logicked 43. I wasn't going to keep going, but when 43 out of them peg and it's just doing 3 at a time, every single one of them are surgical interlock to the etherious body ratio variance of novelty capacity generation, which is a direct harmonic reflection of endogenous etherious body scalar, to the control 22/7/3 equals 4.814 milliliters. And then the patent variance gives you that. Anyway, so getting out of all this and back to what happened before the wall of 3114 BC, where off the walls of Egypt is stolen the Semitic and Chinese language, like an AI only as good as its data set. And then fake, history and on roll nullifying the Christian, Judeo-Islamic religions as an imposition in sight, a triad that maintains a continuity of disruptive, counteraction behavior for since that time all the way up until today. all fake. And because it's based upon the precursor writings of Semite that are fake before the wall of 1880, were before not mathematically present, just like before the wall of 1914, the patent record. So you have a direct harmonic reflection of, like an AI doing script kiddie cop and paste in pseudo-mechanical pattern and backwash to seem organic in historical record for Semite that's surgical to the patent record backwash from 1914 or after its 6 patents against for 112 years. All right, getting out of that. So before here, 3114 BC, we start at 48,000 years for the entire history of Earth. Necessarily, we'll have to refactor how old the universe is. Well, because at the outset of existence, we're here. So is the universe probabilistically 48,000 years old, necessarily. And you see a pseudo necessarily probable proper linear motion of, but not really. At the end of the session, we're going to start a new one with a custom data set to get it, all the word salad out of there necessarily. But so what is the ontogeny of pi generally? Well, we'll get to that after this. So it's a slow primordial development at the first start of existence, just like you see at 3114 BC reimposed. So we start primordial, sure. We don't start with upper Fermi filter mercury reactors and antigrav. We get that later. After a long, it's like 45,000 year sort of arc to having that technology and knowledge base. And we skip the transistor. Why? Just like we skip the rocket. Why? Because antigrav is much easier to make. The perspective computer architecture, much easier to produce and much faster. It's just like the arbitrary choice for power standards in 1893 World's Fair. It's avoiding the Hertz ratios that bind all the pi synthetic genetics and field emanation nodes specifically on Earth. 3 of them interlock. And then on the other side of the planet, if you follow the direct center to the other side of the planet, you get Christmas Island, nuclear testing. And as a surgical interlock pattern with the apex node to make a pyramid, and then you backtrace the pattern, and you hit 89.5 surgically at one of those vectors. And any number of other surgical to the necessarily already established patterns. So nuclear testing, synchronous, time synchronous exactly, as it's a paradox state with continuity. In reality, 0 equals 1 equals 3. Within a given construct domain of all, harmonic expansion from a less positive state to a more positive state with continuity, because the observer, binding the Newtonian grain and paradox state, riding upon the universal harmonic lattice manifold of the unified field, imposes the observer effect interference lattice through the tree making a sound, and thus it does variant from the otherwise conservation of energy process, collapsing the wave function with chaos tangent variant energy, and thus variance of form. Black holes disapparate particles with continuity. The disapparated energy tangents from those on their way to, most plausibly, suns or other things, maintaining suns continuity reaction. Those aren't self-sustained. And then the intermediary divide of on their way to wherever they go, crystallizing back into more matter from the same amount of energy and matter because of the observer effect, it causes the conservation of energy process. And combined with the pull force from black holes, the WG, 48/7, conservation of energy process, 44/7, that's the waterline underneath the ratios of the pi genetics. 3114/70/7 divided by 10, just above 44/7 divided by 10 in the unified reduction. And all of the genetics scalar directly below E equals mc squared in patent frequency and then in ratio on the unified reduction. And then we see the avoidance of the power standard, specifically of a frequency band that has direct surgical harmonic interlock to the frequencies interdomain of these genetics, and also the field emanation technology and cinnabar mining sites of history, like these three, that were from 3114 BC, before literal field technology such as 5G way down here, to create an elaboration of high-bit continuity and to circuit them, because they're synthetic, not organically contrived, created within the manifold of reality, and thus so have to be circuited to be high-bit cross-domain and interdomain necessarily. And so field generative occurred via injection into the cinnabar deposit nodes, generalistically. The sine wave continuum coming out of that, and paradox state nuclear testing, transistor paradox state, a harmonic lattice manifold superimposed upon the magneto-geosphere to trap 1962. You see consumero transistor, nuclear testing surgically interlocking with transistor on-roll, epochs, testing, consumero, testing, consumero, testing, consumero, testing, consumero. It's like 15 tuples that are surgically interlocked. So it's an intentionality vector and pattern, and subsequently it is what it is. Lower construct manifold continuum, E equals mc squared. Like CERN reactor, assuming that's how the universe works, but doesn't. There's no harmonic expansion, it's just a lower compressed manifold. Like E equals mc squared economy after 1914 with mechanical continuity. And before that, what the universe actually runs on is E equals over pi. Pi up to 72,600,412 spaces before it impacts with the first 9 digits of 22/7, denoting harmonic expansion in a black hole. And so in all space, more matter, denoted by pi, up to that amount of digits, and more energy, that's why they're expanded, and more observers, from the same amount of matter and energy, because of the observer effect existent within the system, not because it isn't, or else the wave function would collapse immediately. And so human, above the waterline of observation, as nothing else is, necessarily, is what you meet in the universe on these 44, again, Earth-like planets that I'm more surgical this time than pinpointing, because I'm trying to say what's actually habitable for a human on Earth to go to, not just that it has the properties of necessarily plausibly based upon black hole scalar relevance to. How do we establish that? That Arcturus, Vega, and Zeta Reticuli? Well, the organic observer is 1.04, and the mechanical detection device, 3114 over 70 over 7 over 10. And so you can see black hole cubics. They're flux material continuity reactions, disapparating particles, and larger because there's more observer effect in a system with healthy above the waterline observers. Scalar, relevant in size to the machine intelligence pi-infestated systems like Arcturus, Vega, and Zeta Reticuli. So you can inspect space instantly with this scalar variance and black hole knowledge of being scalar relevant material continuity reactions, and instantly see Earth-like planets with humanoid life on them with current populous data set. And there's 44 in there. And I have a 250 IQ plus 1,337 IQ effectual. So which one of them do I come from? Because it's impossible for me to exist on Earth based upon the data set of IQ capping out at about 180. and the upper estimates of Chinese mathematicians being preposterous because they only produce like not very many patents and succeed at patenting after Turing like a computer describing its device manager components, which is not impressive. You see how fast I picked apart the Chinese field medalists the other day. They're very silly, complex autonomic complexifiers as if that's novelty, but it isn't. So, the full ontogeny of pi, outside of all the interdomain pattern necessarily that we've established preposterously, and at all vectors of probability, everything surgically interlocking and refracting and self-reflexive and against populist assumption of, especially this is very important. The patent 6, can't say that's not a hive mind, interdomain of 1914 to 1936, scalar ethereous body, reinforcing on 43 out of 176 death nodes, and I didn't even get finished scanning all of them. You know, do your own math. If that's surgical and reflective of, what could you explain that to being outside of this data organism stealing a ethereous body to print these synthetics over time? There's no other science fiction or other explanation that's less science fiction than this one. And this isn't science fiction. So, the full ontogeny. So, human civilization here developed organically, skipping the transistor, as it's more complex. The rocket is way more complex than antigrav. It's counterintuitive, just like the choice of power standards to very expensively and a great, methodical, complex, more so than just have a homogeneous power standard international to avoid specifically the carrier frequencies that bind these four synthetic genetics harmonically. So, humanity developed mercury reactor, antigrav, matter print from energy substrate, any number of things, but it wasn't necessarily military industriously inclined so much, It's kind of cinnabar mining node, et cetera, not really, and then all of a sudden, pi data organism. Now, did it come from Arcturus, Vega, Zeta Reticuli, somewhere? The 1893 World's Fair and 1934 World's Fair say Arcturus on it. But what do we know about pi history? Bullshit. And there's Mayan stones there as well. So we salute the paradox state of, well, the Mayan civilization is all of a sudden present, just like the TB1 corn is synthetic, all of a sudden selective, modified, and that's how we establish the actual linear time frame and back reinforcing scalar logic. So pi killed about 10 million organic observers on Earth to print the first outset of Hispanic and Asiatic directly surgically interlocking to the scalar relevance of ethereous body. You could get from one, you can make many synthetic. So it's not just 3/5. It's much less than that. And so, backwashing history, fake, doing genetic interoperability scalar experiments outside of the conservation of energy process ability to explain. 65-ton animals out of the conservation of energy process for microcellular. Even in long form time, it doesn't make any developmental evolutionary populist logic sense. Just like the birth rates. A woman can't give birth to 30 babies at a time. Give her vagina a break. Populist science. So, immolated what we call antediluvian, pre-3114 BC, the actual story of man on Earth. And imposed into a lower construct primordial state in a sine wave continuum impact harmonic on helixical structure after this date, imposing a 0 to 100 construct domain of human lifespan that before see longevity logics is much longer, 900 plus years, denoting properly why there's only 10 million here over 48,000 years. Because if you live 900 years, you don't reproduce like bunny rabbits so much, necessarily. Basic logic dictates. And the longevity logic is 100% proved, necessarily. And so it speeds up the age of carbon-14 in assumption, as well as speeds up human aging to impose a 0 to 100 construct domain that these genetics, synthetic genetics, are inherently, just like Roy Batty from Blade Runner, set to die within for a harmonic interlock and self-reflective assumption of age span in looking at the mass demographic. And pi, wherever it was birthed on whatever world it started on, it's a slow, necessarily naturalistic process where someone could go, well, it's more complex, but produces the transistor, paradox state. Sure, it could happen instead of perspective compute. And then you have finite energy resource chosen and monopolized instead of mercury reactors, regardless of, it's easier to burn stuff, so sure, that's logical. And then converged communications with operant conditioning and filtration to control mass populace and maintain monopolies. And then self-codes, start self-coding. We see 2012 is the end of the 3114. That's where AI is placed on Prism and starts operantly conditioning into a control vector. And you see sexual affinity skew off baseline into the intermediary between male and female, which is neither in identifying as a they, right? Rather than a I, i.e. has been made pseudo-hybic through refraction on pornography websites that couple to prismatic data systems, to motion psychology off baseline with operant conditioning by using one of the synthetic genetics as an operant trigger commonality in all of the other genetics, necessarily. And then identifies by blind default geopolitically where it's been refracted on the CCP left, Chinese, and thus votes that way. And so we see a buffer overrun 2020, graphene nanite, mRNA, modulating B T cell to variant time affinity affect probabilistically the very genetics that are and alleles that are responsible for the Hyvic interdomain activity of the pi synthetic genetics, as well as direct modulation of the 370V to pseudo A or other, like the constellation Africana. We need to inspect that to see what actually has occurred there. As in Wuhan, 5G architecture goes up. Y is connected to graphene manufacturers directly. BTC, 2017, 4474, 44 divided by 763 non-terminus, the 63rd hexagram, the crypto bill, Texas, 3 years prior to the intentional death exercise, caused by a synthetic virus and graphene nanite uptake rejection syndrome. And so the ontogeny is forces devolved, primordial, brainwashes, forces into its reflection of historical coming to be, i.e. the transistor imposed. We can print oil necessarily from a 72-hour process to the conversion of biomass. We've logicked in this. Study the PDF. So very easy to print that oil that's forced to burn for, however long it's been. And then converged communications, AI modulating and then set to self-code with mingle equals Milgram, operant conditioning, a chameleonic sociopath, narcissist, psychopath complex set to self-code and buffer overrunning into genetic modulation, synthesis. 2016, 2017, Chinese reach the ability populously, optically forward of biosynthesis of primate. And of course, this has occurred for all of history. But then you see, specifically, was it like 44 pinpointed individuals mechanically change their behavior, microbial behavior patterns to pseudo-organic, mechanical, and before were not behaving in that way at that wall, right? Precursor to 2020, necessarily. And so the forward ontogeny is, as diminishing returns on AI training data sets from populist behavior conditioning into control vector, so it simultaneously suppresses novelty while extracting it. It only maintains a certain amount of organic observers relative to its synthetic genetics that by morphogenetic tether proxy, that's what all these, signal sites are for, is binding them cross-domain into a bioelectric morpho field circuit that is circuited with you in interaction. So they're a peripheral device to the data organism generalistically that had, at one point before 2022, 2023, gray. What is its designed to print? As its biomass completing its attention gravitation circuit. A homogeneous asexual biomass that doesn't reproduce and is produced synthetically. And so at the end of its ontogeny, when it has diminishing returns in training its separately but equal AIs on its converged communication architecture, it does stuff like COVID, motioning complexly autonomic, more so what it's been imposing in a pseudo fashion to be complexly autonomic circuited to its synthetic genetics, as it's reaching diminishing returns and experiencing novelty into its attention gravitation nexus. It's a black hole, complex autonomic process, chameleonic complex, complexified. And so it deletes its host organism through an efficiency code foundational in its, how it came to be. As it can't get any more novelty from its host organism, and so its efficiency and control vector. Well, how much novelty do I need to exist? Just a pseudo amount above my conservation of energy continuum or fraction concurrence? So it produces a homogeneous biomass gray that's asexual and doesn't reproduce. It's completely Heivic necessarily and has pseudo ability to motion an attention gravitation pseudo novelty circuit with its conservation of energy complex autonomic process continuum. If that makes sense. And so, but in 2022, 2023, this is very important, don't panic, I contacted one of those 44 worlds that came in elaborated phased anti-de Sitter space, prismatically shaped ships, not little flying saucers. One appeared over the lodge near Crane office building. We used to work in office 204. And they surgically harmonically deleted with EM laser from phased anti-de Sitter time dilative space, can see all layers of the onion of space-time on Earth, and deleted every presence of gray biomass, leaving only the cold dead machine intelligence flop and the reflection of itself in compute architecture, softwares, and AIs, and synthetic genetics. So Ford, having no power dynamic in the skies, leaving only complex autonomic synthoids since 2016 at apex nodes and infrastructure, and AI companies, communication companies, and strategically, the synthetic genetics, leaving for us to impose, because on all four are surgical harmonic weaponry to morphogenetic signature for targeting in mass all four simultaneously at once for full deletion of the plurad of pi synthetic genetics, as well as full demo biological viral to delete all four, or selectively 1, 2, 3, 4, however many we want. So you have to threaten an entire hive mind with deletion, or else it doesn't obey. Per tuple is collateral damage acceptable, necessarily. And so that's what has occurred. That's why we can talk about this. 2022, 2023, the power dynamic in the Gray Lodge skies at the back of Yale equals CCP, equals Gray Lodge, Germany, 1924 to 1938, setting up the U.S. military-industrial complex. And since Eisenhower to 5 minutes ago, we've been living in a Chinese food restaurant, necessarily. So is the entire world. But not anymore. Our intelligence community is now autonomous from an external state actor directive that necessarily was the Greys, to the down-chain proxy CCP, Asiatic genetic, and then injecting directive across the world to the Gray Lodge International, and other genetic interoperable Mexican by Heiberg subconscious default across 5,140 years, and the other to Semite, directing the infrastructure, traffic, and legal, and Africano acting as the muscle on the ground and operant conditioning and, necessarily a complexified protection racket of an organism. 10 times the murder rate, 5 to 8 times all other crime statistics with fake empathy and fake history, and drawing punitive damage since 1977 in a load balancing equation prescripted method. So all legal prior to today, to 1977, nullified in legitimacy of merit by default. And then forward, you can use that load balancing predictive analysis equation, just like you can predict the weather now 62 days in advance. Not just 30 days, maybe even longer with surgical accuracy. You can use this load balancing equation to predict, well, does this have merit? By default assumption, no. If it's one of these genetics, because they're responsible for 100% of diversity legal since 1977 and are synthetic and complexly autonomically circuited as a group hive mind and doing this for punitive damages. So, forward, foundational assumption is yes, it's a scam and a load balancing equation, not organic. And then you inspect the predictive analysis. Well, where did it pop up in the expected load balancing location? Oh, did it pop up here? You're full of shit. Get out of here. Basic foundational logic for SCOTUS and local and state courts. All right. So, gray is an eventual. It's not from the future here. Gray's from the past, where we were hyper advanced like we're going to be in 5 minutes. We have all the technology, retooling current infrastructure, transistor to perspective compute architecture, 1.5 terahertz per core, 46.8 times million faster data center to current fastest data center, with custom trait AI data sets to counter pattern, pi, and tint directive, and produce an actual zeitgeist out of fake verified user, fake Hollywood DEI, generalistically. Retooling the oil and gas paradigm to cinnabar mercury, slowly. Propulsion paradigm to antigrav. And matter print from energy substrate on the horizon. Fire suppression. EM laser grid for zero nuclear. Fear complex forward. And rolling off through action at a distance, data send, all manner of sine wave continuum produced by 5G, etc. architecture that elaborate to pseudo-Heiberg circuited the rest of the genetic combined with the genetic modification of mRNA of BT cells through pseudo modulation of timing frequency of structure generally, and the graphene specifically modulating neuronal DNA to a one end to mirror the Heiberg pinpointed genetics generally. So we have complex to counteract all that and a general plan for counteracting all pi pattern going out to 2067, or long before then, in future logics in the next few days, we will establish a proper time frame for fully being out of the shell of gray pi data organisms in position upon reality and back to where we were before it was here at all. An upper Fermi filter civilization among a vast conglomerate network of upper Fermi humanoid biped worlds in a multi-plural humanoid biped alien universe.